After studying this module, you shall be able to get an overview of the key issues we have covered in this course, understand what were some of the main takeaways from this course with respect to policy in the short run vis-a-vis the long run and in open vis-a-vis closed economies. Appreciate that apart from output and employment, interest rates, exchange rates and inflation are among the most important macroeconomic variables. Understand that expectations play an important role in affecting actual outcomes, and learn about the views of different schools of thought in macroeconomics such as classical, Keynesian, neoclassical and new Keynesian schools. Introduction. In this, the final module for this course, we shall first provide a brief overview of the main issues that were discussed in the various modules. This will be followed by a discussion of the various strands of thought that have led to different approaches to policy making in macroeconomics. We have touched on these differences at various junctures in this course. We hope that the discussion in this model will further clarify your ideas about some of the differences between classical and Keynesian economists, especially regarding government intervention vis-a-vis reliance on the market forces and regarding the importance of demand vis-a-vis supply side economics. A macroeconomic analysis and policies, key issues and takeaways. At the very beginning of this course, we introduced some of the key issues that macroeconomists are typically concerned about, which was in module 1. And then we began the course with a discussion on certain basic tools and accounting concepts. First, we learned how to define and measure one of the most important macroeconomic variables, that is GDP, which we did in modules 2 and 3 of a nation. Our discussion on measurement of GDP on the equivalence between aggregate income, expenditure, production approaches and on national income identities served to highlight several important interrelationships among macro variables. We obtained a basic idea about how production gives rise to employment and income generation, and about the importance of spending by households, firms and the government, the key economic agents in a macroeconomic context. We also learnt about key variables in an open economy, that is exchange rates and international trade and capital flows, and about the balance of payment, an important accounting concept in an open economy, which we studied in modules 4 and 5. Thereafter, we introduced our very first analytical construct, one of the simplest models of the economy that helped us capture the determinants of aggregate output in a Keynesian framework, which we discussed in modules 6 and 7. The simple Keynesian model emphasized the importance of aggregate demand in the presence of excess capacity on the supply side, which allowed the operation of the multiplier effect, a one-shot increase in an exogenous component of aggregate demand, leading to manifold increase in aggregate output and income. Extending the Keynesian framework to include the money market helped us to understand how interactions between the real and financial sectors simultaneously determined aggregate output and the rate of interest, which we studied in modules 8, 9 and 10. It also gave an idea about the role of banks and especially the central bank in the conduct of monetary policy. This framework was particularly useful for understanding the interlinkages between the real and the financial sector, the operation of monetary and fiscal policies and their impact on key macro variables like consumption and investment. The Keynesian framework was also used to analyze the implications of openness to international trade and capital flows, which we studied in modules 11 and 12. This allowed us to understand the role of exchange rates under alternate exchange rate regimes, that is fixed versus flexible, and also gave an analytical foundation for appreciating policymakers' concerns regarding trade deficits and unfettered international capital flows. This analysis paved the way for a deeper understanding of the implication of interest rates, a key macroeconomic variable, and of the interrelations between interest rates and exchange rates in an open economy setting, which were in modules 13 and 14. In fact, later in the course, we delved deeper into problems such as sustainability of current account deficit and explored issues such as causes behind currency crisis and their implications, module 27 and 28. The globalized world has witnessed increasing integration of domestic economies with the world economies. As such, it is very important to get a flavor of some of these issues pertaining to open economy macroeconomic analysis. A second macroeconomic environment essentially stems from stability of three key macro variables, that is interest rate, exchange rates and inflation. The ISLM framework captured the first two of these but not the third. Therefore, the model was extended to incorporate the impact of change in the aggregate price level, and we introduced the ASAD framework in modules 15 and 16. The aggregate supply curve or the AS curve essentially captured the relation between price and output via the labor market, where negotiations between workers and firms or employers determined wages and employment. Price setting by firms depended on existing market structures, while output was determined by the nature of firms' production functions. The aggregate supply curve essentially captured this complex relation between aggregate price levels and aggregate output. Indeed, as we saw, there is some debate on the exact nature or shape of this curve. The aggregate demand or the AD curve captured the impact of prices on goods and money market adjustments and gave the relation between aggregate price levels and output from the demand side. The ASAD framework was useful for analyzing the impact of monetary and fiscal policy on prices as well as output, and it gave an idea regarding the process of adjustment involved for attaining full employment equilibrium, which was in module 17. From aggregate prices, we move to the determinants of inflation, one of the most widely discussed macroeconomic phenomena. Using the Phillips curve, given the importance of the labor market for determining aggregate prices and inflation, we first examined various theories of unemployment, which was in module 18. Thereafter, we saw that short-run version of the Phillips curve highlighted the role of the labor market and of wage and price setting by firms in determining the rate of inflation, which was in module 19. While the long-run version of the Phillips curve was essentially very useful for understanding the role of inflationary expectation in affecting the actual inflation rate, which was in module 20. In fact, the role of expectations was also explored in more detail later on in the course as we examine the implication of various theories of expectation formation, such as adaptive expectations, rational expectations, etc., and its implications, especially in the context of financial markets, which was in module 29. Moreover, our discussion on currency crisis also showed that expectations about the future can be self-fulfilling and therefore play an important role in precipitating economic crisis, which we studied in module 28. One of the key empirical regularities in macroeconomics relates to time path of aggregate output in an economy. Typically, output fluctuations follow cyclical patterns in the short and medium run, whereas a secular increasing trend is mostly commonly observed over longer periods of time, for example, 50 years or more. We examine the phenomena of business cycles and especially emphasize the importance of identifying leading indicators in order to accurately predict upturns and downturns in economic activity, which we studied in module 21. We also examined the determinants of key components of aggregate demand by looking closely at theories of consumption and investment, which is modules 22 and 23. These theories can be useful for gaining insights into the underlying causes for fluctuations in aggregate demand and output. We also examine theories of long-run economic growth for an understanding of the factors explaining trend increases in output over long periods of time, as well as for the reasons some countries achieve faster growth in per capita income than others, which is in modules 24, 25 and 26. These theories highlighted the importance of savings, accumulation of physical and human capital, and technological progress for long-run growth. They also gave us a framework for appreciating the role of the government, especially in provision of a suitable institutional setup that fosters education, knowledge creation, innovation and productivity growth. An important objective of this course was to enable you to get a handle on policy issues. Therefore, we separately discuss specific issues related to the most commonly used tools of monetary and fiscal policy, especially in the context of India, modules 30, 31, 32 and 33. Herein, we try to give you insights into certain theoretical issues, for example, various concepts of government deficit and their relevance, channels of monetary transmissions, as well as discuss their practical relevance in context of India. Finally, we closely examine the factors leading to the global financial crisis that occurred recently and had its origins in the US subprime crisis of 2007, which was in module 34. This discussion highlighted the close linkage between the real and financial sectors, the importance of asset prices, especially housing prices, as macro variable, and the relevance of policy, especially the Keynesian style active government intervention during an economic depression. To sum up, in this course we learnt about the interrelation between the real and financial sector and the key role of macro variables like interest rates, exchange rates, inflation and asset prices, which are, for example, stock prices, housing prices in the economy. We also learnt about the determinants of various macroeconomic variables like consumption and investment, the importance of expectations in affecting real outcomes, about underlying causes of economic crisis, for example, the currency crisis, financial crisis and so on, and the role of policy in this context. Further, we study the role of policy in the short run as well as the long run and in closed as well as open economies. In the short run, we saw the key role of monetary and fiscal policies in stabilizing business cycle fluctuations, whereas in the long run, the supply side was more important and government policies with respect to establishment of appropriate institutions for fostering innovations and productivity growth played a key role in affecting the long run rate of growth of an economy. Schools of thought in macroeconomics, a brief overview. In any discussion on macroeconomic theory and policy, we'll come across references to macroeconomists who belong either to the Keynesian or classical or the new Keynesian or the new classical schools and so on. In what follows, we shall try to present the differences in the approaches and policy prescriptions of these various schools of thought, wherein we shall try to give you an idea about the underlying reasons for these differences. Classical economists argue that smoothly functioning, perfectly competitive markets can lead to optimal allocation of resources and efficient macroeconomic outcomes, while excessive government intervention was seen as undesirable as it could lead to distortions and suboptimal outcomes. Their views, the role of policies should be restricted to correcting for distortions, that is arising due to externalities, and to enhancing competition, for example via free trade policies. The foundation of classical macroeconomic thought can be traced to the free market doctrine first advocated by Adam Smith in his 1776 treatise, The Wealth of Nations. However, as you have learned in the course on microeconomics, markets lead to efficient outcomes only under conditions of perfectly competition or perfect competition with full flexible prices of commodities and factors that respond to changes in demand and supply condition to bring about equilibrium. Yet, these factors were not directly addressed, even somewhat ignored by the classical economists. According to this view, since labor market functioned just like any other market, therefore wage price flexibility was sufficient to take care of the problem of unemployment. Excess supply of labor, that is unemployment, would drive down wages till it became profitable for firms to hire workers, and the increased output could always be sold by lowering good prices sufficiently. There was little room for active government intervention, which was regarded more as a source of impediment that would hamper the smooth functioning of markets according to this view. The classical economist prescription was seriously challenged with the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, when unemployment persisted and firms faced excess capacity for years and the market mechanism failed to restore equilibrium. This was the economic backdrop that saw the emergence and consequent dominance of Keynesian macroeconomics. In 1936, John Maynard Keynes published his famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, which inter alia presented a strong case for government intervention at times when the economy experienced recessionary conditions. Keynes highlighted the rigidities normally encountered in capitalist economy systems that prevent smooth functioning of the market mechanism in a real world scenario. In particular, when the goods market is imperfectly competitive, firms can set prices above marginal cost, maintain constant profit margins, and also collude with each other for joint profit maximization. This can prevent price flexibility even with excess supply of goods in the market. Also, in the presence of trade unions and minimum wage legislations, wages tend to be sticky in the downward direction. This would explain why wages may not fall sufficiently even in the presence of widespread unemployment. Further, another very important contribution of Keynes was to highlight the critical role of effective demand in determining the level of output and employment in a macroeconomic context. This was in sharp contrast with the classical position, which focused almost exclusively on the supply side, that is, on the production of output. An important insight that emerges from Keynesian analysis is the key role of aggregate demand, that is, planned spending by economic agents in determining the level of output and employment in the short run. We studied this closely, especially in the first part of this course, where we saw that in the short run, in the presence of excess capacity and with given prices, A, output was demand determined, and B, there was no reason why output would be equal to the natural or full employment level. Keynes pointed out that when lack of effective demand is the underlying cause of an economic recession and rising unemployment, a fall in wages can actually make matters worse by leading to further reduction in purchasing power and hence reducing effective demand even further. In this context, government intervention is required as fiscal and monetary policies can be used to inject additional demand in the economy so as to enhance spending, which is aggregate demand. This would lead to an increase in output, employment, capacity utilization, and revive capacity creation. In the process, the economy would gradually emerge out of recession. The success of Keynesian policy during the Great Depression created a strong case, especially for the use of discretionary fiscal policy to stabilize business cycle fluctuations. However, in practice, this also had a downside, as it almost gave governments a license for fiscal profligacy in many cases, especially when governments were run by corrupt, irresponsible politicians and bureaucrats. Excessive government, especially on unproductive consumption rather than investment, led to unsustainably high levels of public debt. In some cases, widening fiscal deficit also led to current account deficit and high levels of external debt. In few cases, this even caused external crisis, that is currency crisis or sovereign debt crisis, especially when countries had adopted free exchange rates. So the Keynesian policies were critiqued by the monetarists such as Milton Friedman for underplaying the role of money in the economy and for giving, in their view, undue importance to discretionary fiscal tools. Further, these policies fail to explain the phenomenon of stagflation experienced in the US in the 1970s, characterized by persistent unemployment as well as rising inflation. The new classical view gained currency at this juncture, especially by providing an explanation for the simultaneous occurrence of high unemployment and spiraling prices that did not fit into the Keynesian framework. The new classical economists highlighted the role of expectation, that is inflationary expectation, in shaping actual macro outcomes. An important contribution of this school was the concept of rational expectations that you have learnt about in one of the earlier modules in this course, an idea that had tremendous influence on advances in macroeconomic theory in the 1980s and 1990s. They proposed that utility maximization by agents with rational expectation led to optimal macro outcomes, and in their framework, there was little role for systematic policy interventions even in the short run. As you can see, the new classical and classical schools share the same basic ideology in terms of reliance on the market mechanism and with regard to the role of discretionary government policies. The new classical economists stressed on the importance of micro foundations for macroeconomic theories, and one of the grounds on which they criticized the Keynesians was the lack of proper micro-theoretic justification for the Keynesian assumptions regarding wage and price stickiness. The response to this critique has come from the new Keynesian school, which has engaged in extensive research aimed at providing sound micro-theoretic foundations for the Keynesian arguments. Their research tries to address features such as oligopolistic markets, imperfect information, absence of rational expectations that are observed in reality. The new Keynesian have in fact strongly criticized the new classical economists' assumption of rational expectations, which they point out is rather unrealistic, as there is a limit to the amount of information that can be processed even by a rational individual. In response to such criticism, the new classical school has also engaged in research aimed at modifying their framework and improving its explanation for macro phenomena such as business cycle fluctuations and unemployment. As in the case of Great Depression, the global financial crisis of 2007-8 and the policy discussed in the previous module has once again shown that during economic depression there are no alternatives to the Keynesian style expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, as self-correcting markets are unable to restore equilibrium in such cases. Currently, therefore, the consensus seems to be that market-based new classical style macroeconomics is best suited for economies in normal times, while the Keynesian approach provides the solution in terms of unusually deep recession or economic depressions. At least two things should be clear to you at this point. First, the classical and Keynesian school have both evolved as they have attempted to modify their theoretical structures in order to account for changes in the real life macroeconomic phenomena. This is one of the exciting features of this field, that research is ever changing as theory tries to account for facts and in doing so provides a basis for meaningful policies. Second, you can see that as the new classical and the new Keynesian school attempt to modify their framework and provide better models of the economy, there is an emerging consensus that micro foundations for macro theories are of paramount importance. Conclusion. In the final analysis, what we can say about which school of macroeconomic thought is best for analysis and policy in the Indian scenario. In this context, note that in principle there is no reason why we must adhere to any single school of thought. Rather, one should have a clear understanding of the basis of their arguments and policy prescriptions and apply what is best suited to the particular economic context. However, in practice, the new classical ideology has a dominant influence on policy making today, and even India and many other developing economies have embraced globalization, opted for market-oriented policies and committed to fiscal consolidation. In case of India, as in many other developing countries, it is well understood that markets are imperfect, characterized by structural rigidities, for example, wage price inflexibility, restriction on hiring and firing of workers, etc. Yet since 1991, the government has undertaken a slew of market-oriented reform measures with greater reliance on private initiative for economic growth and a gradual yet steady rollback of government controls on the economy. Clearly, until and unless the economic reform programs enhance efficiency of the market mechanism, they may not have the desired outcome. Summary. 1. This module provided an overview of the main issues relating to macroeconomic analysis and policy making, both short-run and long-run policies in open and closed economies. 2. It also provided insights into some of the key differences among various schools of thought in macroeconomics. And third, classical and new classical economists advocate market-based policies, while Keynesian and new Keynesian economists highlight the many impediments to smooth functioning markets in real life and make a case for government intervention.